Hi, yeah. Mike Kelly, Shropshire Hills AONB Partnership. I'm Natural Environment Officer with the team. We've been looking at a project in the AONB, which is looking at our peatland resource, and we feel it's a very much overlooked part of our AONB in terms of both its habitat and also its carbon potential. Can you just advance the next slide, Lizzie? Thank you. Topics I'd like to cover are the importance of our peatlands, the challenges that we have to our peatlands, and I'd like to zoom into England's peatlands, and then zoom in further to the peatlands of the Shropshire Hills AONB, and then even further zoom in to a study of the Clun catchment, the peatlands in the Clun catchment, and then look at some next steps, how we move forward with management of this vital resource. Next slide, Lizzie. Right, well, our peatlands are among some of the most valuable ecosystems on Earth. They're critical for global biodiversity. In Indonesia, our orangutan population is dependent on peatlands. So unfortunately, they're disappearing at an alarming rate. Peatlands are vital for providing clean drinking water. They act as a natural filter. Peatlands are a natural sponge. They mitigate flood risks, so they hold the water in the uplands and release water slowly. Of course, they also help address climate change as carbon sinks. Sphagnum moss builds up year on year to actually lock that carbon into the peatland. They're also the largest natural terrestrial store of carbon on the planet. We often think of trees, but it's not necessarily the case. The area covered by near natural peatland worldwide is greater than 3 million square kilometres, sequestering 0.37 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year. And it stores more carbon than any other vegetable types in the world combined. Problem is, our damaged peatlands are major sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and annually it's releasing almost 6% of global anthropogenic CO2. Next slide, Lizzie. Our peatlands are vital for wildlife. Peatlands are generally species-poor places, but they host highly adapted species as sundews, sphagnum moss, cotton grass, and so on. They often include a range of rare or threatened declining plants or species. And in the Shropshire Hills, we have species such as lapwing and curlew, which are declining in numbers. It's not directly related to the loss of peatlands, but it's all part of the picture. Peatlands cannot function as islands. It's necessary to consider not only the peatland itself, but also its connection to other habitat patches. And the image on the bottom right-hand corner is probably an image that you're very familiar with. This is from John Lawton's Making Space for Nature, came out about 10 years ago. But this is looking at how we would make bigger, better and more joined up landscapes. So probably in the Shropshire Hills, we could look at the core area as being somewhere like the Long Mynd, and another core area could well be the Stiper Stones. And we've got in between that an area of intensive agriculture. What should we be doing there? We should be trying to create stepping stones between those two very important islands of biodiversity. And indeed, we do have a project in the Shropshire Hills being led by the National Trust called the Stepping Stones Project, amazingly. A similar analogy is in the Clun catchment. We have the Clun forest, the uplands of the Clun, and then the Team Valley in between. On the other side of the valley, we have Beacon Hill. Again, we could consider the Beacon Hill and the Clun as two core areas. And the thing is, how do we manage to connect those up in what is essentially a highly fragmented landscape? The other problem is, if our peatlands are too widely spaced, is that they are. It's very difficult for species to move between these sites, and what we need to be able to do is connect up these core areas by corridors, or making them bigger by buffering and so on. So here's an example of a healthy peatland. When we think of peatlands, we probably through our minds are sort of cast to the wild moors of the Pennines, or Glenlimon in the Cambrian Mountains, or maybe the Somerset Levels, or the Fens in East Anglia. But Shropshire has a small amount of peatland, and it is significant for very many reasons. This picture is the wild moor on the Longmynd. If we look at Ordnance Survey maps, it's amazing how many places in the Shropshire Hills make reference to peaty or boggy places, and the wild moor is one of those. Well, we've got Black Marsh, we've got Black Hill near Clunton, we've got Catherton Marshes, we've got Quabs. I think Quabs is Old English for a peaty or boggy place. We have Ross Fiddle, a Shropshire Wildlife Trust nature reserve. Ross, I believe, is Welsh for a wet or moorland. We have Badger Moor, we have Black Bank, we have Prollymore, we have The Bog, we have Clee Marsh, and there are hundreds of other examples. What they all have in common is that they signify that they're wet places, or that they used to be. And I'd like to touch on that during this discussion. So what's a healthy peatland? It's a net carbon sink. It means it's accumulating biomass. If it's accumulating biomass and not losing it, it's a carbon store. And as I've touched on earlier, it also supports some unique biodiversity. A healthy peatland supports good water quality. As I said previously, it's a natural sponge acting as a filter. Also, very important historical, cultural and environmental records. Our peatlands often, because they're anoxic environments, whatever's stored in the peat actually stays in the peat and doesn't decay. And quite a few artifacts are often found in peat bogs. We've heard of peat bodies, but in Shropshire, we've also had some very significant finds. There's something called the Broadward Hoard, which was a votive offering, we believe, of Bronze Age spearheads. And Broadward is in the Clon catchment. It's near Gunford. And these Bronze Age spearheads were deposited in a place locally known as the Bog. Obviously, our peatlands support sustainable land use, and what better place to stretch your legs than some of our wide-ranging hilltops, such as the Longmynd or Stiperstones. Next slide, Lizzie. So, what's the damage peatland look like? Well, this is a site in the Shropshire Hills. It's identified on the British Geological Survey map as peatland. So a damaged peatland would be a net source of carbon equivalent. We would be losing carbon through dissolved organic carbon by runoff. We'd be losing peatland through particulates to the atmosphere. This would ultimately deplete the carbon source. Obviously, not a very attractive place for biodiversity. Not many places for wildlife to hide in a damaged environment. Also, obviously, the loss of any historic archive there. Also, we would, in places like the Pennines, A big problem with coloured peaty water, where we have a lot of peat erosion, and a lot of the water utility companies, such as United Utilities, are spending quite a sum of money trying to address coloured peaty water. And of course, when we have damaged peatlands, our recreation or our enjoyment of them is rather compromised. Moving on, Lizzie. So what's the challenges? Probably drainage has the single largest impact on our peatlands. It takes 1,000 years to build up 1 metre of peat. But in as quickly as 50 years, if we drain a peatland, we can lose that 1 metre. Historically, peatlands are close to industrial centres, such as the Pennines, suffer from sulphur dioxide pollution, and that has an adverse impact on sphagnum. Nitrogen deposition has increased over the last 50 years from transport, intensive agriculture, and this creates a sort of a eutrophic environment, and that has an adverse impact on sphagnum, which is the building block of our peatlands. 20th century draining of peatlands for commercial forestry, we've seen quite a bit of that in the Shropshire Hills. If you look at maps from the turn of the century, from the 1900s, much of the forestry doesn't appear on the maps. Overgrazing, peatlands are very susceptible to grazing. They have low carrying capacity for livestock, and high grazing suppresses vegetation. Burning on grouse moors can be a problem. We don't have that in the Shropshire Hills, but certainly in the Pennines, it's an issue. In the lowlands, waterborne nutrient enrichment can be a problem. Too much phosphate, too much nitrate can enter the bog and again suppress the building blocks of peatland formation. And of course, climate change may well exacerbate many of these drivers now and in coming years. I don't believe there's burning on the long wind, Adrian. Looking at England's peatlands as CO2 emitters, this map's quite revealing. The green indicates that our peatlands are actually accumulating peat. Therefore, they're not net emitters of greenhouse gases. But it's interesting to look at this map that most of England's peatlands are actually net emitters of CO2 or CO2 equivalents. It's reckoned the peatlands of England can contain more carbon than the forests of Europe. So in the global context, the peatlands of England are very important. However, in a few generations, we've transitioned what was a net carbon sink into a very large emission source, which exceeds around 23 megatons of carbon per year for the UK. If we just zoom into the Clun, you can see that the Clun is this little square box in the bottom centre is a source of greenhouse, is a major source of greenhouse gas in our context, being in the highest category, probably emitting something between 17 and 25 tonnes of CO2 per year, which in a place like the Shropshire Hills, where we don't have that much peat, I think is very significant. Next slide. Next slide, Lizzie. So, where is our peatland in the Shropshire Hills? This is a soilscapes map. Our peatlands are Stonebridge, Upperton, Black Hill, Stowe near Knighton, around the Clees, Silverton and Catherine Commons, and Angel Bank, Bivestone. It's interesting that the Long Min doesn't actually feature as peatland on this soilscapes map. It actually is considered to be freely draining acid soil over rock. I think there's a recognition that our peatlands are not adequately mapped, and the new England Peat Action Plan one of the outcomes of that is to adequately map the peatlands of England. We're looking forward to seeing an up-to-date map. Next slide, Lizzie. So this is an interpretation of British Geological Survey peatlands, also Ordnance Survey map of marsh and mire. The little inset map with the blue lines, that's the soilscapes map indicating where our peatlands are. And that's combined around 3,000 hectares. So in terms of area, it's not insignificant. The yellow dots are the British Geological Survey sites and our Terbury Commons. And the red dots are sites where the Ordnance Survey have mapped marsh or mire. So again, I think we've got quite a resource there in terms of certainly peaty pockets and areas of shallow peat. Next slide, Lizzie. The question is, can we restore 3,000 hectares of restorable peatland in the Shropshire Hills? It's very ambitious if we can, but we need to take a look at it and see if we can do that to play our part. Historically, we've had a lot of land draining going on in the catchment. The image on the top left-hand side is typical when you look at aerial photographs of the Shropshire Hills. You see this herringbone pattern in the landscape, which means that the fields have been dug and pipes have been laid to drain parcels of land. The problem with that is, as I said previously, it actually reduces the peatland resource by oxidizing the peat, and that is lost either to water or to the atmosphere. The centre picture is Rossfiddle Nature Reserve, a Shropshire Wildlife Trust Reserve in the Clun catchment. It's a triple SI. You can see it's all nice and brown like it should be. Probably the last remnant of heathland, intact heathland in the Clun forest. Fence next to it, or the field next to it, is bright green. It wasn't like that not too long ago. The other image is of the Stiper Stones. You can see a very abrupt edge to the moorland of the Stiper Stones. And in the left-hand corner of that, that's identified as peatland by the British Geological Survey. The land below it is all drained. If you look at aerial photographs of that land, you can see the distinctive herringbone pattern in the landscape. Next slide, Lizzie. So let's have a quick look at the Clun. The map on the left-hand side is a tithe map from the 1840s. So this is the Upper Clun in the 1840s. Very much an open landscape, and the purple line is the 350-metre contour. It's around 1,150 feet. So these are the plateau lands of the Clun, and as you can see, back in the 1840s, it was mostly an open landscape. But looking at the map on the right, this is now, we can see that all this upland has largely been enclosed, and that's been subject to great modification, and much of it has been drained through land drains, through improvement, for obvious reasons, so to grow food, but it's mostly acid grassland. There's bound to be liming going on, and then this is being funded through our agri-environment schemes as we speak. So in terms of restoring peatlands to the Clun, we need to think about how we do that and still make this land as viable land in terms of agriculture. Next slide, Lizzie. So where does the water go when it rains in the catchment? What I'd like to do is have a quick look at 4 locations in the Clun catchment where we can potentially look at restoration of peatlands to deliver bigger, better and more joined up. So the top area is a place called Lower Shoreditch. And there's, on the left-hand side, we've got a place called Riddings. The bottom centre, we've got Rossfiddle and Bigton Hill. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, I'd like to take a look at Black Mountain. Next slide, Lizzie. So this is Rossfiddle. This is the Turberry, Lower Shoreditch Turberry, which is a Shropshire Wildlife Trust reserve. This is an image from around 2000, an aerial image from around 2000. We can see the yellow dot indicating peatland, and to the bottom left also yellow and red dots indicating peatland and mire habitat. You can see that the Turberry there exists as an island. It's surrounded by a heavily gripped landscape, which is draining fields to the south and to the east and to the north. On the area to the right of the Turberry, which is the brown area in the centre, you can see that that's area of what is now conifer forest is actually heavily gripped. There's a surrounding ditch draining all that area conifer forestry, and similarly to the left, there's an area of conifer forestry now which is heavily gripped and is draining to the south. The inset picture, you can see the land drains at Black Bank, the characteristic herringbone patterns. So what we've got at the Turberry, the Lower Shoreditch Turberry, is an island of moorland which is being drained all around it. We could restore it, and we could look at doing conifer, felling conifer to restore it back to moorland, blocking the ditches, blocking the boundary drains. And what we've got in the centre, sorry, to the southwest, is an area of peatland and an area of grazed grassland in the middle. That is also peatland, but it is disconnected from the Turberry. We could look at restoring that, and maybe we should be talking to Natural Resources Wales about how we go about managing these conifer plantations, and also the local landowners to connect this landscape together. Next slide, Lizzie. So this is the Lower Shoreditch Turberry. You can see in the distance, on the horizon there, the conifer forestry that's sprung up over 20 years. Bottom left-hand corner, you can see boundary ditches, and the centre, another boundary ditch, draining the site. The picture on the right-hand side is the intervening land, which the landowner there is quite keen to look at how that's managed, because he says it's not very productive for livestock. It could be productive for other things, and we could be paying the landowner through new environmental land management schemes, perhaps a more attractive way of managing the land rather than struggling to raise sheep. Or even the other option that the landowner had considered was planting trees, which I think would be perhaps the wrong option at that place. Next slide, Lizzie. This is an aerial image of Rossfiddle. Rossfiddle is the large brown area with the yellow dot. Again, Rossfiddle exists as an island in a rather intensively managed landscape. You can see the fields to the south are a very different character to the moorland of Rossfiddle. To the right, we've got Bigton Hill. And again, it's quite revealing that we can see there that we've got lots of sort of valley mire habitat. And Rossfiddle itself has drainage ditches going across it. Here we've got restoration potential within the reserve itself. We've also got boundary ditches around Rossfiddle, which further drain the site, which sort of causes it to sort of restrict to the core sites in the centre. So even within the reserve itself, we probably could do some work at improving the wetness of the moorland itself. It's very easy to do. We just stop the water running off the landscape by blocking ditches. To the right, we've got land that's not part of the reserve. It's being managed for livestock, but I feel that it has potential to be connected to Rossfiddle in terms of trying to restore some of these more wetter habitats. And again, there's quite a few drainage ditches that runs through the site that we could probably look at in terms of holding water back up onto the top of the hill. Next slide, Lizzie. So this is Rossfiddle and Bigton Hill. You can see that there's a distinct difference in the landscape there. There's an abrupt change in vegetation between Rossfiddle and Bigton Hill. It's the same geology, same rainfall, it's just different management. And again, through new environmental land management schemes, perhaps we should be talking to the landowner, or we could be talking to the landowner, how we could improve or increase the wetness of this site to make it a bit more like Rossfiddle, and improve and try and recruit some sphagnum moss to these areas. We have some nice peaty valley mires already, and as you can see in the images on the bottom. Next slide, Lizzie. This is Riddings. We have an area of deep peat at Riddings and a number of valley mires, but the land to the east of the area of deep peat and to the south and to the west is quite heavily modified. You can make out the characteristic pattern of land drains on the area to the right of the area of deep peat. And I've walked this area recently, and it certainly would be an area that could easily be reverted back to moorland, and some of these valley mires could be expanded. Next slide, Lizzie. So this is the area of deep peat. Unfortunately, it's not in particularly brilliant condition. It's at the moment it's being I think quite heavily grazed. There's a lot of poaching going on there. There's a lot of actually material from outside of the site being deposited on the site. The centre picture is the outfall of the field that has all the land drains in. Again, it'd be relatively easy to actually do something about that in terms of blocking up those drains or removing those drains, and encouraging that area of what was former peatland to be restored. The right-hand picture is an example of one of the valley mires that feed the area. Next slide, Lizzie. This is Black Mountain. An area that has 3 Turbary Commons on it. The Turbary Commons are the areas that are here, here, and here. And Turbary Turbies are places where peat cutting used to be historically practiced. And the interesting thing about this area is I think it's much larger potentially than it could be in terms of its peatland resource. We've got areas here and down here near Black Mountain Chapel, which are the same sort of habitat. intervening, we've got an area of conifer forestry, and we've got conifer forestry here. And again, I think this represents an opportunity for peatland restoration by connecting all this area together by different form of land management. And again, we could, when this is a crop, when this is felled, should we be thinking about replanting with another conifer crop, or should we be thinking about how we could connect these two areas together better? I'm not suggesting that this could be peatland. It could be something else, but it could be better than just a conifer crop. You can see here characteristic ditches here, which are draining the site. Another ditch coming down here, draining the site. And again, if we could do something about blocking those ditches, it would certainly expand those areas. Conversations we would need to have if we're looking at restoration of those 3,000 hectares in the Shropshire Hills. Next slide, Lizzie. So these are the turberaries. When you stand in them, they are big and they feel quite expansive. And I think if we can look at connecting all these places together, we can have them even bigger. I mean, there's a feeling of that you're in a big landscape when you are up there. The problem is that they are fragmented, and you can see that conifer forest that's actually separating those two areas of wetland. And not only is that incongruous from a landscape point of view, I think that would be really good to look at that area in terms of restoration, in terms of trying to expand the peatland base in the Shropshire Hills. Next slide, Lizzie. So, how do we go about doing this? We've got this week. We've had the England Peat Action Plan released. It was actually released on Tuesday. This sets out England's plan for restoration of peatlands. It is ambitious, but I don't think it's ambitious enough. They recommend or suggesting we restore 35,000 hectares of peatland. When we look at the peatland resource and we look how much peatland is degraded, if we go back, if we looked at that map of England, the peatland resource in England, we can see that a lot of our peatlands are actually net emitters, and 35,000 hectares isn't anywhere near enough. Nevertheless, it's a start. We have this month, the Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme has been released. This is in two phases. There's a restoration phase and also a discovery phase. So for shovel-ready projects, partnerships can apply for funding to this Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme. The Shropshire Hills are talking to the National Trust and Shropshire Wildlife Trust about a partnership scheme to look at Shropshire Hills, peatlands in the Shropshire Hills, at 30,000 hectares. The great thing is the core sites, such as the Longmins and Rossfiddle, are actually in the ownership of people like Shropshire Wildlife Trust and the National Trust. So what we'd like to be able to do is talk to the intervening landowners as part of the discovery element of the Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme to see if landowners will be amenable to looking at how we try and connect these core sites together. And this is where these new environmental land management schemes come in, delivering public money for public goods. There's little information about the actual intervention rates, but for them to deliver public goods, they have to make it viable for landowners to be involved in a project like this. It will require the collective effort of not only the landowners, but farmers, foresters, trusts and government agencies to actually make this work. So it's a very aspirational, but it's something that's needed to be done. The other element I perhaps should mention is also this private enterprise model, which is looking at a UK carbon land registry, where investors can look at investing in our landscape as part of their carbon offsetting. I'm not sure how it's going to work. It might not work for an area like the Shropshire Hills, where we've got a limited peatland resource. It may well work very well for the Pennines, but it's something out there that's going to be driving forwards how we deliver the England Peat Action Plan. That's probably enough from me for now. I'm not sure how long we've got, Lizzie, but 12:06 now. Could you put that last slide up, Lizzie? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. And then maybe you could take some questions.
Yeah. It's relatively easy to actually try and add water to our peatlands. All we need to do is block up the drains and the ditches that allow water to run off. And this can be done through a range of very simple techniques, such as timber dams, using peat itself, using heather bales. They're all very good at restricting the flow. All you need to do is restrict the flow. You're adding water, you're stopping the peatland drying out, you're stopping it oxidizing. If you're adding water, it will allow the building blocks of peatlands to start regenerating, i.e. the sphagnum mosses. So it's not necessarily very expensive. Each one of these can be put in for about sort of 30 or 40 pounds. So in terms of capital costs to restore peat, it's not very expensive. The difficulty is actually how we manage that land and make it pay for the landowner. So I think that's enough chat from me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent. I'll just have a quick look through the chat. Is there anyone that wants to raise their hand and come in while I have a look at the questions in the chat?
Veronica?
Yeah, I wanted just to say, Veronica from the Shropshire Wildlife Trust, do you think people generally realise that by letting peatlands go on breaking down, we're releasing a great deal of carbon dioxide? Are people generally aware of this? Because it's a big contribution by just doing nothing, we let it break down.
I don't think people are aware of the importance of our peatlands. I think they've been largely overlooked in the conversation. A lot of our conversation in terms of sequestering carbon is directed at planting trees. And planting trees is something we need to do. We set ourselves very ambitious targets for planting trees. It'd be nice to see similar targets set for restoring peatlands. And I said 35,000 hectares is a target. It sounds a lot, but I don't think it's necessary as much as we really need to. When we look at peatlands in terms of their global emissions, it's 6% of global emissions. We've clearly overlooked peatlands as an area that we need to be addressing.
And if you plant woodland into peaty soil, on balance, is there a net loss of carbon?
But by virtue of planting trees in peaty soil, you are damaging the peatland.
Yeah.
So for trees to grow in the most advantageous conditions, you probably be wanting to drain the peatland. And forestry has lots of grips in it. And grips, when I mean drainage ditches. So the forestry around the Turberry plantation is all gripped. So the Turberry is actually its actual core area is being reduced even further because of the land management around it. Well, planting trees on peatland is bad for lots of reasons.
Yeah, yeah.
So if we are
Thank you.
planting trees, we should look at other areas.
Great, thank you very much. I can see, Ken, you've got your hand up. Would you like to come in next?
Yeah, really
Okay.
just reinforcing what Mike said, but you know, you touched on the idea that as forestry comes to harvest in the uplands, then reverting to wetlands ought to be a positive action that should be encouraged. Working in Wales with CPRW and well, the Wales Environment Link and also NRW, peatlands is always the Cinderella. I mean, it's interesting, you're looking at 35,000 hectares of peat recovery in England. NRW has set a target of 5,000 hectares within the next 5 or 6 years. And the trouble is that because forestry is commercialized, then that is getting the majority of everyone's attention. And I, for one, think that we're looking at too much dependency on afforestation. After all, it's going to take 40 to 50 years before it's fully effective in helping reduce carbons. And one other thing that you don't, well, maybe except on Longmen, but one of the big problems in mid Wales, as you know, especially in the Cambrian Mountains, is the encouragement, I would say, of off-road vehicling and so on. In a sense, the Ceredigion Council, I can understand this, but in order to prevent, if you like, illegal off-roading, they've now actually laid routeways where people can off-road, but all they do is go off into the areas off those ways. So there's an awful lot that Pete can do, and I think getting the message out is essential.
Yes, it's very important. I think Peatlands has had its moment in the news this week, but I suspect the news agenda will move on, and we won't hear very much about Peatlands in the near future. We have to keep it we have to keep it high profile as best we can.
Great. Any other questions? So I see we've been invited back to the main room. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining this breakout room. I hope you found it interesting, and hope you can be involved going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.